Hello and welcome back to Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L, Jason Leusey. It's good to see you guys. Today, it's actually our second to last video with regards to the Sacrament of Holy Orders. So today, we're going to talk about the Sacrament of Holy Orders. We're going to kind of wrap up kind of the main things that we talk about, and that we're going to talk about the recipient and the effects of the sacrament. Now, a bit of spoilers. All right, the next video we're going to be tackling kind of commonly misunderstood aspects of the priesthood. So I'm going to mention a couple things, and I'll say these are things that we're going to talk about in the next video. So just putting it out there. So like I said, today we're going to talk about recipient. So who can receive the sacrament and the effects of the sacrament. What does it do to the person who has received it? All right, before I jump in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, especially if you have any questions about the video, about the content I covered. Please feel free to leave any comments below. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to kind of talk you through it and kind of walk you through that kind of stuff as well, because I know that you guys have questions out there. So please, like I said, fire away if you think of anything. So let's jump into it. We're going to talk about the recipient, right? Now that term recipient, once again, refers to the person who receives the sacrament. Now with all sacraments, there are certain requirements for the recipient. And so in this sacrament, the recipient must be baptized and confirmed, right? They must be male, and they must have received the previous order, okay? So we'll kind of look at some of those. So they must be baptized and confirmed, all right? So with all the sacraments, baptism is a requirement, obviously with the exception of baptism. But baptism is a requirement for every single sacrament, right? This is no exception. Now, it is also a requirement that the person be confirmed, all right? And the reason for that, it certainly has to do with the sacraments of initiation, that all three of them that means we have become full and complete members of the church. We have received the fullness of God's grace, kind of available to us in those sacraments of initiation. And so that's kind of why you need that kind of baseline of baptism and confirmation. All right. Now, the next thing is that you must have received the previous order. Okay, so that means if you are going to become a priest, you have to first become a deacon. All right. Now we're going to get into some of the terms here, so I'll break it to you right now. Right, so deacons, there are two types of deacons. Right, there are permanent deacons, which are men who choose to become a deacon, right, but have no intention of becoming a priest. Okay. So chances are at your church, right? Certainly at my church, that we have plenty of deacons, right, who are married men who are also deacons. We can get into that a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit in the next video too. Why is it that deacons can be married and not priests? But anyway, we'll get that later. So we have these permanent deacons, right? These men who have been ordained deacons that have no intention of becoming priests, right? We call those permanent deacons. Now, if you've ever had a priest, or a seminarian stay at your parish while they've kind of in that process of becoming a priest, you may have had a seminarian who's also a deacon, right? And seminarians who are going to seminary to become priests, they spend about a year as a deacon, right? We call them transitional deacons, right? In that they are transitioning from being a lay person to being a deacon to being a priest, right? So in order for someone to become a priest, they must first be a deacon, and then the same logic applies, right? In order to become a bishop, you must first be a priest. Now, we could look back at church history and look at very famous saints like St. Ambrose, who wasn't even ordained anything, and then they ordained him a bishop, which would have been totally scandalous and certainly would have been completely illicit or not okay. With the exception of if special permission was granted by the Holy Father, right? So if the Pope himself was like, you're moving up to the big leagues, well, then that's something that could happen. But realistically, it doesn't, right? It just really doesn't happen. So that's kind of the chain of command there. You're a deacon, and then a priest, and then a bishop. So you must be the previous order as well. So lastly, you must be male. So we're going to talk about this in our next video. In the next video, we're going to talk about why we don't have women priests and things like that. So stay tuned for that. But one thing that is really interesting is that there are age requirements. And in fact, as I was researching this, I learned something too, which I thought was pretty interesting. So these are some of the age requirements, just some kind of interesting things to know and consider, right? That the different age requirements for all of these things. They're about the same, but they're pretty interesting no matter what. So a transitional deacon. So in order to be a transitional deacon, you must be a minimum of 23 years old. All right, so to be a transitional deacon, which is someone who's going to become a priest, you must be a minimum of 23 years old. Now, an unmarried permanent deacon, right? So someone who wants to become a permanent deacon who's unmarried, that age requirement is 25 years old. That, I had no idea. I didn't even know that was a thing, but there you go. So an unmarried person who wants to become a permanent deacon, that's it, right? They just want to become a deacon and not go on to become a priest, 25 years old. Now, a married person who wants to become a permanent deacon, the minimum age requirement is 35 years old. And then for a priest, it's 25. And for a bishop, it's 35. So there you go. It's kind of how it all breaks down. Do you need to know those numbers? No, but I think it's really interesting to just kind of know, hey, there's an age requirement. That's something that's kind of expected of them. So last thing I want to go into with the recipient before we kind of move on is just celibacy. Now, that's a term that we're going to talk about in our next video as well. So in the next video, we're going to talk about why we only have male priests and why our priests are celibate, all right, which means unmarried, okay? So we'll get into that in the next video. So just letting you know, in case you're like, hey, Mr. Lews, I feel like you kind of left us hanging here with some important stuff. We'll get into it. Don't worry. But here's the next thing. Effects of the sacrament. There are kind of two main effects of the sacrament. And the first is the sacramental character, which is just a term that Aquinas would use to describe the indelible mark, all right, that a person receives. Now, we've talked in my class about indelible marks. An indelible mark is a permanent change to our soul, right? It's a sacramental character, right? So the characteristics, the way your soul is permanently, eternally, forever changed, right? We receive these at baptism, at confirmation, and in holy orders, right? And that our soul is permanently forever changed, that it is not the same as it was, and it will never be the same again, and there's nothing you can do to change that. And I can't make that more clear. There's nothing you could do to remove an indelible mark from your soul, right? That when it is received, and it stays there for eternity, right? So if you're a priest here on earth and you go to heaven, you're a priest in heaven. So there you go. So that's pretty cool. Now, as I said, these indelible marks that they receive kind of corresponds with the order that they're receiving. All right, so priests and bishops, right, their indelible mark that they receive, or rather that sacramental character received, allows them to kind of perform the sacraments, right? That even a really, really holy deacon, right, could not hear your confession, could not say the Mass, right? Couldn't churn bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. They can't. They don't have that ability because they don't have that sacramental character, all right? But that's something that priests and bishops have, all right? So that's an important thing as well to consider and think about. So the next thing is sanctifying grace. Now, we know that in all of the sacraments you receive sanctifying grace. And sanctifying grace is God's help, right? This gift that God gives us that stays with us, right? And it makes us holy, right? So this grace is God's life within us, right? And the more that we have God's life within us, the more we're like God. And you're following me. You guys should know what sanctifying grace is. If not, I do have a video talking all about grace, so you should check it out. So now, the sanctifying grace that each order receives is a little bit different. So in the bishops, when they receive sanctifying grace, right, it's primarily a grace of strength, right, that they are strengthened to govern and lead their diocese and defend their diocese, right? So that's kind of the main focus, or the main kind of effect, if you will, of the grace that they receive in that order. Now, in priests, right, the grace that they receive, the sanctifying grace, has to do with the worthiness to perform the sacraments, right? That the grace they receive helps them to perform the sacraments, that enables them to kind of do that. And lastly, with deacons, it's this grace of service. All right, it's a grace of service. Now, the last thing I kind of want to leave you with is just kind of talking once again about the recipient and kind of that kind of stuff, and the role of a priest. We talked about the offer, sacrifice, yada, yada, yada. And just to sum it up like this, right, that the primary function of a priest and a bishop, certainly a priest, is to administer the sacraments. That is their primary function, right? That is their primary job, is to administer the sacraments and to make their people in their church, in their congregation, holy, right? So they're called to a life of profound service, profound giving of themselves, profound just sacrifice, right? And it's an amazing, it's a beautiful calling from God, right? And certainly, right, they're called to teach and govern and sanctify their community, and that's really at the heart of what a priest is called to do, right? Administer the sacraments above all else, right? So any opportunity giving out the sacraments, that is your job, your role, your purpose as a priest, and within that you're also called to, right, govern your church, lead your church, but that's kind of, in a sense, important, absolutely, but it's there as kind of a piece of three other things, right, that you're teaching and you're sanctifying, right? So there you go. Just wanted to leave you with that, kind of the role, kind of that final role of the priest a little bit. So thank you so much for joining me. Like I said, we got one more video talking about this. Hope you guys stick around for that. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This has been Theology with Mr. L. I'm Mr. L. Cheers.